APUSH. We are, after 4 weeks of review, back to covering curriculum. We're going to finish off the textbook in the next couple of weeks. And today we're going to kind of pick up where we left off talking about the 1950s. If you remember, back before we started reviewing for your AP exam, we had just started getting into the Cold War. And so we'd finished up World War II. Remember, it ends in 1945. And then those first couple of years after World War II is characterized by this kind of increase in tension between the two dominant world superpowers at the time, the United States and the Soviet Union. And they're competing over a million different things. But what it really all kind of comes down to is trying to decide which economic system is better. Is capitalism or is communism going to be more effective in solving the post-war world problems? Okay, and so they compete in, again, a bunch of different areas to try to figure out, which system is better. And we're going to be, continuing to talk about the Cold War here and there. It's a 46-year-long rivalry, so it's basically going to take us through the end of our year, or at least the next couple of weeks as we finish off our curriculum. But today specifically, we're going to talk about the 1950s economy. All week, we're going to be looking at the 1950s, different aspects of it. But today, we're focused on the economy because it's really the 1950s economy that comes to transform society and make the 50s what it was and what we kind of remember it to be. And so it's important to start here as we start to look at this decade more closely. But in order to fully understand the 1950s economy, like usual, we have to go way back. In this case, we have to go all the way back to the 1930s. So remember the Great Depression. You have FDR who comes into the presidency. He's looking for a way to fix unemployment and all of the economic problems of the Great Depression, and he comes up with his New Deal. And remember, he had some limited success with public works programs, welfare systems, all of these different things that he's using to try to fix the economy. He has some success, but it's not total success, right? There's a little bit of relief there, but not full recovery. Full recovery of the economy doesn't come until World War II, when you have Americans going back to work in mass and all of these new industries kind of reopening, right? So the military becomes the main consumer during World War II, and they're demanding all kinds of military goods. So you have all these factories that open up. You have women, largely, who are going to work in those factories. And then you also have men who are either working in factories or who are overseas earning a paycheck as soldiers. So it's because of World War II that we can say that the United States fully recovers from the Great Depression. Okay, that's where we kind of left off with the economy. Today we're going to kind of pick up there and talk about what it looks like after. Now, because so many Americans go back to work during World War II, even when these men come back home, there's a lot of jobs for them to have, to be a part of. And so the 1950s economy, we can characterize it as a period of affluence. When we look at the 1950s, what we characterize this decade by, we call it the Affluent Society. And that's because by this time, most Americans, the majority of Americans, have made it into the middle class. Now remember, the middle class is unique because they have enough money to meet all of their basic needs. Like, the working class, they're working to make money to meet their, for their rent or for clothing or for food. The middle class has enough money for all of those basic needs, but they have a little bit of more money so that they can go out and buy consumer goods, and they are the ones, therefore, that largely fuel the economy and economic growth. And so it's important that by the time we get to the 50s, that the majority of Americans are enjoying this middle class lifestyle because, again, they not only can provide for their basic needs, but they can go out and buy a bigger home, they can buy cars, TVs, all of those consumer goods that characterize the 1950s. Okay, so it's an affluent society. We remember this decade as being very prosperous. Okay, there's a lot of different reasons why it's very prosperous. Again, the recovery from World War II plays a big role in it. You have all of these new jobs, and the Cold War is largely fueling even more of those jobs. We're going to see in a second on the next slide that the South really opens up and has all of these new industries developed that are geared toward manufacturing weapons and aerospace technology and all of these types of resources that are needed for the Cold War competition. So that's one reason why. Another reason why is when you look at the landscape after World War II, the world is a mess, right? I mean, Europe is just, again, just like after World War I, completely destroyed. And so it's really the United States that emerges as that industry leader and dominates world markets. If you need to get stuff, you're going to get it from the United States because Europe just doesn't have the capability to make anything, right? So America becomes the dominant industrial power after World War II and is largely satisfying world demand for goods because Europe is just kind of out for the count, okay? This is also the last decade that's really characterized by heavy industry and farming, right? So up until this point, factory work, most jobs in urban society, they were focused on what we call heavy industry or kind of blue collar work. So building railroads, working in factories, making cars, that kind of stuff. But now we're going to see that in the 1950s, because of all of this new technology that we have, people start moving out of blue collar work and into white collar work. So like information science, finance, education, entertainment, the service industry, all of these industries have so much growth during the 1950s. Not only does it spur on prosperity and affluence, but it also means that America is transitioning out of blue collar work and into more white collar dominated work, which is where we largely remain today. So that's kind of the foundation of the economy in the 1950s. It's a time of prosperity because of all the new industries, because that transformation of technology, and because of the recovery after World War II. So all of that economic success, it brings about tons of changes throughout American society. One of them we kind of hinted to already is it really transforms the South. Now, every time we've talked about the South up until this point, it's just been sad. It's been terrible, right? Like they just can't get out of their farming rut. After the Civil War, they can just never really recover. They try with like the sharecropping system, and they just try all of these different things, but it just falls flat. That largely ends during this period. The 1950s is when they get their economic transformation and they finally make that break away from farming. And that's because, again, the Cold War has such a large demand for airplanes and for nuclear weapons and for defense air bases and for military bases and all of these kinds of things that are being used to fight the Cold War. Americans have to kind of look around and say, where are we going to put all this new stuff? And the answer becomes the South, right? The South really has been void of real industry all along. That changes in the 1950s and the 1960s with the Cold War. And so they kind of get a makeover. Now their industries are no longer, their economy is no longer going to be characterized by agriculture. It's characterized instead by aerospace and defense and oil, which has become really prevalent in Texas and in parts of Louisiana, for instance. And so all of those new industries, they propel the South kind of forward. You also have a couple of other industries that get popular. With the invention of air conditioning, places like Florida and Southern California, they become tourist locations, so you have a rising tourist industry. And since so many more Americans own cars, they can drive to these places, they can move to these places. So we see mass migration to the South, and this area that we largely call the Sun Belt. If you're looking on your PowerPoint, you can see it's everything in that like darker pink color along the South. So it's not just the typical South that we've been referring to, but this would also include now parts again like Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, those areas as well. So this Sun Belt location, it gets, millions, like 30 million Americans moved to this area during this period of 1946 to 1975, again, because of tourism and largely because of all of the new industries and jobs that are available there. So it kind of gets, again, kind of a post-war makeover. They move away from agriculture into aerospace and oil industries. Another area of 1950s society that kind of gets shaken up or transformed because of all of this new economic prosperity is where Americans live. Right. So remember, if we go all the way back to, let's see, like the 1920s, we talked about how in the 1920s, that's the very first time in American history that most Americans are living in cities versus in rural parts or like countryside. Okay, so that was that first kind of major step in transformation of society. In the 1920s, most Americans are living in cities and not on farms in the countryside. The 50s, we see another transformation of that. Not only are more Americans living in urban environments, but in the 1950s, more Americans are moving towards the suburbs, okay? Now remember, we introduced the suburbs when we talked about like the 1940s And remember, the suburbs are like housing developments right outside of the city center. Remember, the more money you had, the farther away from the city that you lived. You had bigger land plots, you had bigger homes out there. And so wealth kind of becomes equated to where you live in proximity to the city. If you live in a city, you probably work in a factory, you're working class. The farther away from the city that you live, still in that urban center, not necessarily on a farm, but in that urban center, the more wealth that you have. Okay, so we see that just boom during the 1950s, and that's because you have so many soldiers that are coming home. Okay, you have to think in this period right after the war, you have millions of American soldiers who are coming home, and they need housing, they need jobs, they need all sorts of things in order to transition back into American life. And so the president at the time, Truman, he's really, he has a strong desire to help these men kind of transition back into American life. And so he asked Congress to sign a law called the GI Bill of Rights. Super important. Underline it, circle it, whatever on your lecture notes. It gives all kinds of benefits to these veterans who are coming back after World War II. So some of the things that it does: it helps them find jobs. It gives them unemployment benefits. It gives them financial aid so they can start going to college, which, by the way, transforms higher education. Before this, not many Americans went to college, like they're barely finishing high school. But because of the GI Bill of Rights and this aid, this financial aid, you have more Americans who are continuing their education into college. But something else that it does is it gives them money to purchase a home, because remember, they need housing. And so now you have all of these millions of men who have these vouchers to purchase homes. Where are they going to live? They're going to live in the suburbs, because that's where the land is, and that's where home construction can take place. So the GI Bill of Rights not only opens up all of these opportunities to these returning soldiers, but it also spurs on the home construction industry, because now you have to build homes for all of these millions of Americans who are coming back after World War II. In addition to that, I mean, just think about it. You have these men who have been, writing to their wives or to their girlfriends throughout the war. They come home, they're just like super excited to see them. And because of that, we get something in the 50s called the baby boom, which is just an explosion of population, really between the years of like 1950 to 1957. There are 4.3 million babies born. That's one baby every 7 seconds. It's a lot of babies. So this baby boom that happens in this post-war period, it increases our population by like 27%. And you have to think, just very practically speaking, you need a place to put all of these kids. Like Americans before maybe had a couple of kids. Now they have 4, 5, 6 kids because of the baby boom. You need somewhere to stash your kids. And so, trust me, you don't want to live with your kids in like a 1-bedroom apartment. That's no go. And so these Americans, they start looking for bigger homes. Where are they going to find them? They find them in the suburbs. Okay, so that again is spurring more Americans to move to the suburbs, because they have to find a place to comfortably fit their families. Okay, and so that's another thing that transforms in this age is, again, where Americans live. More Americans are living in the suburbs. Okay. Another area that's transformed by the economy is just consumer industry. Like I said before, Americans are largely now in the middle class, and so they not only have money for their basic needs, but they have money for things that they want, their desires. Some of you might be getting a stimulus check in the mail, and so if you don't need that money to pay for your bills, maybe mom and dad are going to go buy a new TV or buy a new car or whatever to spur on American industry. That happens in the 1950s as more Americans have jobs and have an influx of wealth. And so you have rampant consumerism in the 1950s. Credit cards become really, really popular. They didn't learn from their 1920s, 1930s grandparents. They grow accustomed to being in a little bit of debt. You also have all of these new brands that come out, so like Coca-Cola, Levi's, McDonald's. And remember, in the 1920s, you had the beginning of the advertising industry. By now, the advertising industry is well developed. And so not only is it showing Americans all of these new brands, but it's telling Americans, you need to wear these jeans, or you need to drink this soda, or you need to partake in all of these things. So the demand, coupled with the money that they now have, they go out and they spend it. And one thing that they spend a lot of their money on is television. During the 1950s, television is television already existed, but it's kind of perfected in the 1950s, and it spreads rapidly across the United States. So by the 1960s, 9 out of 10 Americans have access to a television. This has a lot of really important, not just cultural impacts, but also we're going to talk about like political impacts as well when we get to the Vietnam War. Television just transforms America. For example, it brings in new industries, it brings in drive-in movies, it brings in the TV dinner. All kinds of things are changed in American life because they have access to a television. The other part of consumer society that transforms is car culture. Okay, more and more Americans have been buying cars already. We talked about the Model T and Henry Ford. But now car culture becomes about extravagance. You have all of these new models of cars that are marketed to different types of Americans. You have like, the station wagon that is marketed to the American mom who has her 6 baby boom kids. Then you have like the convertible, which is marketed to, the teenage son. And so you have different types of cars that's enhancing culture, and they become largely statements of wealth, statements of affluence, statements of social standing. And so businesses start to revolve around cars. You have more drive-through like fast food, motel industry we talked about. And so car culture and television culture are kind of two aspects of this new consumer society that comes to characterize the 1950s. But arguably the thing that changes the most because of the 1950s economy is the family. Now, we talked about how the family is growing exponentially because of the baby boom. So now you have mom and dad, you have all of these kids. Okay, they're living in the suburbs, they're middle class, they have a little bit of wealth. So not, everybody has to work in a factory just to make ends meet, like has been typical of the American family up until this point. And you have to think about the American mindset after World War II. This is a really chaotic period of time. Not only did they fight World War II, but remember before that, they're super poor, may not have even had a job during the Great Depression. And so by the time we get to the 1950s, and these same Americans now have a little bit of money, they have a home, they live in the suburbs, they crave stability, right? They want to create an ideal society. And we've heard this among Americans before. If you go back to the Second Great Awakening, when you have a tumultuous time, especially a tumultuous economic time in the United States, it's usually followed by this strong desire to create stability and to kind of bring about perfection. So then the question becomes, how are they going to do that? There is this belief that in order to create a perfect society, you have to start at the most minute level. So how do you get to a perfect country? Well, you have to go down, right? And so if we start taking this, all the way down to its most basic part, you have, the country, all of American society. Then maybe you have regions like the South, the North, the West, and then you have states, and then you have counties, and then you have cities, then you have neighborhoods. And then even within neighborhoods, you have families. Now, families, especially the nuclear family, meaning mom, dad, and kids, it becomes, common thinking in Americans, and a lot of people still believe this, a lot of sociologists and psychologists still believe this, that the family is what creates that perfect society overall, okay? So if you can perfect your family unit, then eventually, if you have perfect families, you have perfect neighborhoods have perfect cities, perfect counties, perfect states, perfect regions, perfect country, which is the ultimate goal. So there's this focus on the nuclear family. And so Americans start thinking, how can we perfect the family unit? Well, if everybody has a really distinct job, mom, dad, kids have really distinct jobs, and everybody does their job really, really, really well, then you'll have this perfect family, and again, it will lead to a perfect society. So then the question becomes, that what you should be asking is, what are these jobs? What jobs do each family member have to maintain in order to create this perfect society? Men, for instance, they've largely been seen, it's not new, but they're the family breadwinner. So even in the 1950s, there's more pressure on men to be the ones to go out to work, to make the family's income. They're expected to make the major decisions for the family. That's the dad's job. The mom's job, she's expected to leave her job after World War II, which we're going to talk about more when we get to the 1960s. A lot of women have a lot of reservations about that. It creates a lot of problems later later. But they return home, and their job is to care for their children, to take care of their homes, to kind of be that domestic partner to their husbands. So while their husbands are off working, the women are managing the domestic side of things. Okay, and what really spurs this on is a book called. It's written by Dr. Benjamin Spock. It's called Baby and Child Care. It's not the full name. It's a Common Sense book of baby and child care. And so this book comes out and basically tells American women, like, hey, your job is to raise perfect kids. And so it puts a lot of pressure on women to kind of fulfill every one of their children's desires, to make sure that they're always there, to make sure that their kids are educated, to make sure that their kids have manners and have toys and kind of have this, facilitate this perfect childhood. Puts a lot of pressure on women and kind of communicates to them that this is your job. But what else kind of communicates each of these family roles is television. We just talked about how television plays a huge role in so many different aspects of American society. This is one of them. The shows that come on during the 1950s, many of you, are familiar with these shows, like Leave It to Beaver, for instance. All of the shows and movies that are on TV are communicating these stereotypical roles for the family. So if you watch like a Leave It to Beaver episode, for instance, you have dad who comes home, he puts down his briefcase, the wife is there greeting him at the door. She looks beautiful. She's got her pearls and her skirt. She's got a little apron on. She's got her vacuum. She's been working hard in the home, home all day. She gives her husband a kiss. So glad to see you. He sits on the couch. He does not move after that. The kids come in, greet the dad. Like, it's the perfect family. And so what's the purpose of these shows? It is communicating to Americans what their roles are and how they should be behaving and should be acting in order to create the perfection that they see on the screen. Okay. Now, I kind of alluded to children in that illustration. So we've talked about how the mom and the dad each have distinct roles. Children also have distinct roles. And this is what is so different, because American children, up until this point, they've pretty much been treated like adults in a lot of different ways. They've been working in factories when they need to. Maybe they work with mom and dad on the farm. Maybe they go to school for a couple of years, but not many of them are finishing high school, right? They work as a member of the family unit. In the 50s, that radically changes. And for the first time, again, largely because of that book that I referenced, Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care by Dr. Spock, experts are saying kids need a childhood. Kids are distinct from adults. They're not the same. There's a whole new science that comes about that we have today called child development. And these scientists, they basically look at, humans and say there are distinct stages of development that need to be protected. So instead of just, kid and adult, now there is, newborn, infant, toddler, preschooler, kindergartner, young children, older children, teenagers, young adult. There's all of these stages now to human development, and each one is unique, and each one needs to be protected in order to become a functioning, mature adult by the end of your development. So that's what this new science is communicating. And again, this largely falls on women, right? Because they are the ones, they're caregivers in the home. So that means, if you think about the pressure, if your kid grows up to be, a prisoner, a criminal, is it the kid's fault? No. All of the science and these books that are being produced say, no, this is mom's fault, because mom didn't facilitate each stage of human growth effectively, and her child grew up to be, a convict. So there's a lot of pressure on women, and that's, again, going to have lots of repercussions in the 1960s when we get to the feminist movement and women's rights during that decade. So children now are expected to have a childhood and to enjoy that time. That means they're not working. Maybe they're doing some light chores, but they're expected to go to school. You have all of these new toys that come out. A lot of the toys that you play with came out in the 50s. So G.I. Joe, Barbie, Play-Doh, Silly Putty, Slinky, all those fun toys, hula hoop, they all come out in the 1950s because, again, children are supposed to be playing. They're not supposed to be working. New television shows, again, are marketed just to children. So Lone Ranger, most of the Disney movies that you guys watched when you were kids actually came out in the 50s. Peter Pan, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, all of those classic Disneys that are like locked up in their vault, those came out in the 1950s because, again, children were supposed to be, imagining and playing and enjoying those types of things. But remember, we have different stages childhood now. And one of the new stages that develops is the teenager. Believe it or not, the teenager did not exist until the 1950s. You basically were a kid and then you were an adult. So if you were a teenager, as we would see teens today that 14 to 18 range or so, you were treated like an adult. You fought in a war, you worked alongside your family, you maybe went to school if you were wealthy, but probably not. Now in the 1950s, because of child development and these different stages that are being recognized, the teenager is another stage that's meant to be protected. Now, they're not young children, so they do have more responsibilities. Maybe they have more chores. Maybe they even have a part-time job. And a lot of teenagers who have part-time jobs, just like you guys, they can use their money. Their parents let them use their money to, go out with their friends or buy new clothes or maybe even purchase a car, go to diners, participate in leisure activities. Remember, most Americans are in the middle class, and so mom and dad, they don't need their kids' money. Kids now have a little bit of purchasing power, which is going to fuel the consumer industry, because now there's all of these new goods that are marketed just to teens. Think about the fashion that's just marketed to teenagers. I mean, I still don't understand all of the ripped jeans that you guys wear. That's something that's marketed to teens, and that me as an adult just wouldn't wear. There's new movies that are marketed just to teenagers. There are cars, again, like the convertible, marketed just to teenagers. Diners and leisure activities, drive-in movies, marketed to teenagers. Why? Because they now have a little bit of money that they can spend. TV, also geared towards teenagers. Just like we talked about all of the new shows that are coming out for children, you have new shows and movies that are coming out for teenagers as well. And they deal with, teen issues, things like dating, things like driving, getting along with your parents, making it through high school. All of those shows have those similar themes, and again, they are marketed towards teenagers. And so the 1950s affluent society, this newfound prosperity, not only has a profound effect on middle-class America and the growth of industry, but it just spills over into where Americans live, the family unit, the roles that they're expected to fill, all of the new inventions and consumer industries that are driving American culture, all of these profound effects on so many different aspects of the 1950s society. And we're going to be focusing more on that today in your supplemental activities when you read those primary sources, but also later throughout the week. So if you have questions on anything that I talked about today, make sure that you reach out to me. I miss you guys a ton. I'm so glad to be back to talking about history with you and not just reviewing, even though I was super impressed with your review. I'm just glad that we get to finish out the book together. And I hope you're washing your hands and staying safe.